Hello there, I'm the Biblical Translator, and I wanted to talk about a scripture that was sent to me today. And it was Psalm 82. It was actually Psalm 82, 5 to 6, but I decided to talk about the whole scripture, 82. So let me go ahead because, as you know, I normally kind of condense my time as best as I can, given the parameters of 10 minutes. There's a particular kind of unease that does not arrive with noise. It doesn't crash through the door or announce itself with catastrophe. It settles quietly instead. You feel it when the things that once felt solid no longer hold your weight, when rules seem flexible only for the powerful, when truth feels negotiable, when the ground beneath daily life, work, justice, leadership, and even faith begins to feel unreliable. Psalm 82 names that feeling with startling clarity, and it does so without panic or performance. It simply says almost matter-of-factly, they do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. That line is not poetic exaggeration. It is diagnosis. Psalm 82 is not written to comfort individuals in private distress, at least not primarily. It is spoken into a public world. God is pictured standing in the assembly of rulers, judges, leaders, those entrusted with responsibility over others. And what God exposes is not ignorance in the intellectual sense, but moral blindness. They do not know, nor do they understand. Not because the information is unavailable, but because understanding has been abandoned. The psalm describes people who are meant to uphold justice yet move through the world as though the light is off, as though cause and consequence no longer apply to them. And when that happens, the psalm says, the foundations of the earth are shaken. For modern listeners, foundations of the earth might sound abstract or cosmic, but in biblical language, foundations are always practical. Foundations are what keeps a house standing. They are what distributes weight. They are what allows life above ground to function without constant fear of collapse. In Scripture, foundations often refer to justice, righteousness, truth, and the ordering of society itself. Proverbs says righteousness establishes a land. Isaiah speaks of justice as something you build with. When Psalm 82 says the foundations are shaken, it is saying that the basic structures that allow ordinary people to live with dignity are being destabilized. And we recognize that feeling immediately. You see it when accountability seems optional for some and absolute for others. When systems exist on paper but not in practice. When truth becomes something you can spin rather than something you must submit to. When people in power walk about in darkness, not because they lack education or access, but because acknowledging the light would require change, humility, and responsibility. The shaking is not always visible at first. It shows up as cynicism, fatigue, distrust, a quiet grief that says something is wrong, but I don't know how to fix it. Psalm 82 gives language to that grief without rushing to resolution. What is striking is that God does not begin by addressing the victims of injustice. God addresses those responsible for holding the foundations in place. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? This is not abstract theology. It is moral confrontation. The psalm insists that when leadership fails spiritually, the consequences are not private. They ripple outward. The shaking is communal. Children feel it, workers feel it, communities feel it, even creation feels it. And yet the psalm is not despairing. It is sober but not hopeless. Naming the shaken is not the same as surrendering to collapse. There is something deeply grounding about the scripture's refusal to deny instability. The Bible does not tell us to pretend the ground is firm when it is not. The prophets, the Psalms, even Jesus himself speak openly about houses built on sand, about storms that test foundations, about kingdoms that can be shaken. Hebrew later picks up on this same language and says that what can be shaken will be shaken, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. That is not a threat, it is discernment. Psalm 82 invites listeners today to ask a difficult but necessary question. What exactly is shaking and why? Sometimes we personalize the shaking too quickly. We assume that if life feels unstable, we must have failed spiritually. But this psalm suggests another possibility. Sometimes the unease you feel is not a sign of a weak faith, but of moral awareness. You are sensing that something foundational is out of alignment. You are noticing the darkness where there should be light. You are responding spiritually and emotionally to injustice that has been normalized. That awareness matters. At the same time, Psalm 82 warns against detachment. The leaders in the psalm are not accused of cruelty alone, but of indifference. They walk about in darkness. Walking suggests movement without direction, activity without understanding. It is possible to be busy, articulate, even religious, and still be disconnected from the moral weight of one's actions. When that becomes widespread, the ground shakes not because God is absent, but because truth is being ignored. For ordinary listeners today, this psalm offers guidance without giving easy answers. It teaches discernment. It reminds us that instability is not always random. It is often the result of sustained injustice, avoided responsibility, or silenced truth. And it reassures us that God sees clearly. The shaking is not unnoticed. It is named. It is spoken aloud. It is brought into the light. The closing cry of Psalm, "Rise up, O God, judge the earth," is not a demand for destruction. It is a plea for reordering, for foundations to be reset rather than abandoned, for authority to be reclaimed by righteousness rather than power, for the earth to rest again on something trustworthy. In times like ours, Psalm 82 does not ask us to panic, and it does not ask us to disengage. It asks us to stay awake, to refuse darkness even when it is convenient, to recognize that spiritual faithfulness includes moral clarity, and to trust that naming what is shaking is the first step toward rebuilding what can still stand. Because Scripture never leaves the earth suspended forever. Shaking in the biblical imagination is not the end of the story. It is the moment when false supports are exposed and deeper foundations become possible. And sometimes simply recognizing that you are not imagining the movement beneath your feet, that the psalm itself says the foundations are shaking, is enough to steady you. Not because the world is suddenly fixed, but because you now know where you are standing and who is still speaking into the instability. Psalm 82:5 sits with a psalm that critiques unjust authority and moral blindness. In biblical thought, the foundations of the earth refer not to geology, but to the ethical and spiritual structures, justice, truth, responsibility, that sustain communal life. The verse acknowledges societal instability as a consequence of leaders who abandoned understanding and righteousness, while affirming God's ongoing authority to restore order. And I hope that somewhere out there it touches someone's heart or touches someone's spirit, because I always believe when somebody sends me a scripture, it's not for no reason. I've been sent that scripture for a reason. And that is why I like to share that reason with other people. So I've got one more scripture, John 10, that I'm going to do after this one. So keep the faith, hold strong, and be who you are and love who you are. Bye-bye.